Well,
So, good.
okay, so what you're going to see is two old guys treating the fan. It's going to be a very entertaining event.
I resent being called an old guy.
Okay. Not so old guy. Getting to be older guy. Okay. So in Cantonese, I'm going to know ye gong ye. That's why. You don't want to know it. So, how may we entertain you? Where you want to start?
You can ask us questions.
Yeah, ask us question. But ask him, don't ask me. Yep.
The pictures that you showed earlier about the Chicken May estate,
Right.
is that the resettlement estate that was knocked down? Which
It is, yeah. It was built after the landslide.
The fire,
The
second
fire,
May.
yeah.
So second May fire in the 50s, and the photographs see, were units in those blocks of flats. The first batch, actually, among the first batch of flat built after the second May fire. That was the very beginning of Hong Kong's housing program, the public housing program.
was the same block as the Mayho house. The one that's standing, is it the same?
Did you photograph Mayho House? That was the only block that's conserved.
Oh, yeah. That's now the Jockey Club thing.
There is a gas student room,
Yeah.
water hostel. You didn't, it's the other one. Yeah, no, it's the one that were adjacent to Mayho House, but along the same road.
The same kind of
Yeah,
estate.
exactly the same time,
It was
same design.
block 36. Each one had a number.
You did block 36.
Yeah.
Okay. So Mayho House is block 41. So it's just right next door.
How do you know that?
I'm architect. I mean, ain't no architect. You know. Ain't no architects know about such details.
Yeah, I thought there were only 36 blocks. Because this was the last one.
Okay, good question. I will go back and check. Ain't no detail that I need to find out. See, now you planted the idea in my head. You know, I said, I need to know.
But what's interesting is somehow the drawing which Hoyen did, a very beautiful little sketch of the exact dimensions, 9.6 feet by 10.6. And the thickness of the walls and the height was 8.6, I think. It's an almost perfect cube. And the way I exhibit this is that I build a room exactly the same size. It's exactly the same size. It has the same window and the same entrance. And I put all 100 photographs inside this room. And it's a totally different way of seeing these things because you suddenly enter a room which is tiny. It's really tiny. And you see how these, how the people live. So it's sometimes in art the presentation is very important.
There's context. I mean, you're really reconstructing the context so for people to understand the photograph. But that reminds me of one of my my favorite exhibition of yours. It's the Toy Story. Talk about the Toy Story.
Talk about the Toy Story.
So you went to the all around Hong Kong. You got like literally thousands and thousands of pieces of toys.
That has nothing to do with Hong Kong, but
It's been China, the toy factory.
yeah.
But I'm all about the toys.
I went to America and rented a van, and I drove from San Francisco to Los Angeles. And I went to every second-hand store and every flea market, and I bought every single toy which was made in China, more or less smaller than my hand. And the goal was to collect 20,000 toys, and which means more or less 700 a day. And in the end, I managed it, and I packed it into a container and sent them back to Hong Kong. and I sanded down the back of each toy and attached one of these super magnets to it, and then I did an exhibition 45 square meters with a metal sheet, thin metal sheet on it, and I attached the toys with the magnets, 20,000 toys. But it's more than that. That would sort of be interesting and gimmicky, but I then went to China and photographed, I took portraits of toy factory workers who made these toys. And I think I put 13 portraits up, and they're surrounded by the toys. So it's interesting. You see the toys first, and then suddenly you see these portraits, and it becomes a totally different type of installation. But it's hell to put up.
20,000 pieces.
20,000 pieces.
But the interesting part of it is that when you told me the story about a woman coming to the exhibition and she started crying.
Yes, it was shown in 2004, the first time here in Hong Kong, and a lot of children came by, and sometimes even they had birthday parties there, because for children it was just fascinating. And I was there one afternoon, and this 10-year-old girl came, and she started crying, and she said, "Up there is my favorite toy, and it was lost in a fire, in a house fire." And she was just so sad, so of course I gave it to her.
No choice. This relates very much to conservation. So we are supposed to talk about conservation.
Yeah.
So I'm struggling to try to find connections. And, so in conservation, we talk about collective memory, collective attachment, and that incident shows exactly the idea of collective attachment and collective memory, how you connect to something of the past in the present. Does it sound
Sounds like
philosophical?
a psychologist.
Yeah, that's right. I'm trying to make myself sound profound. But anyway, Charmaine, you're here, right? Charmaine? Charmaine, where are you? I just saw Charmaine. She disappeared. She walked out. Yeah, too boring for her. I'm good. If she's here, I would like her to comment. She's trained in conservation. And where is she? I thought I saw her a moment ago. Maybe she's under the seat or something.
She's hiding.
Yeah, she's hiding.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Yes, of course.
Okay, because for the title today is conserve no more, and if you know Chinese, you know something very tricky there. And this title was created by Ho Yin. So Ho Yin has to tell us to explain why you would take this title for this dialogue.
For those of us who are Chinese, right? I'm sure we have read Goldang. Goldang, yeah, people laugh, right? And there's a lot of very blunt comment about certain things, and especially when it comes to conservation. So they would write things like "Bo Me El Yong." Okay, so that was originally the title. And Benny, the founder of French Club, when I proposed to him, he said, "Yes, this is a title we want." But after a while, I think it was you, right? You thought like, maybe that's a bit too blunt. Maybe we should modify it, and so it became the two X's. And Benny, weren't you the one who helped GOD to come up with the slogan, the campaign slogan, "Delay No More"? Yeah. So that's why the title is English title is "Conserve No More." So it's for those of you who are not Cantonese speaker. So it's a one word. So if you read it aloud, it sounds like something really bad.
So Ho Yin, you advise the government on heritage issues, don't you?
Well, everybody wants to advise the government. So whether they want to listen is another thing.
Yeah, what do you do?
Yeah.
And what's your experience?
Well, as in all government and anywhere in the world, so it's a big machine. So you have to find the right place just to oil it, and you find the right spot. The whole thing will start into motion. But that spot is very difficult to find. So very often, no matter how much you oil it, how much you throw things at it, you're just frozen. Okay.
But how do you find the spot? What's your strategy?
I haven't. Yeah. I'm still looking.
So it's very slow moving and difficult.
Yeah, and so you have to spend a lot of time, and it's not the work of one person. So it's a good thing that in our the architectural conservation program at the University of Hong Kong, sorry, shameless self-propaganda, we have a lot of graduates who work in the government, so they're helping to try to move things along.
Mm. And you know, Hong Kong has the biggest dried fish market in the world.
Mm-hmm.
What's it called? The Western dried goods market.
Those sell salted fish, shark fin, which is not politically correct these days.
But it's a huge area.
Yes.
And it's going to vanish.
Yeah.
But that's such a wonderful place and so typical of Hong Kong, and for me, it's one of the most interesting neighborhoods.
I know you're interested in those, and people have come to me, can we conserve those? I say, no, you can't, First thing, you try to tell people to conserve shark fin, the shark fin trade, you will get murdered. And the second thing is that these are not, these are intangible heritage. So it's a trade, and if it's an intangible heritage, it's a living heritage, that means it will die. So sometimes you just have to let go. When the time comes that it's no longer viable, acceptable to society. But what
But that's simple.
I know you're getting very cynical, but that's what happens to you when you get older, right? But then what you're really looking for is not the trade itself, but the atmosphere of the kind of old trade, of connection to people. I mean, always go back to connection with people. That is what conservation is about. I mean, never mind about the old building. People will say you want to protect this Tong Lao, that building because it's beautiful, the detail. I mean, that's all subjective. Right? So what they're really harping on is the old ways of we live, and how we engage ourselves in society, and by connecting to people, which a lot of people find missing in today's world. Well, obviously, like I'm being included, I'm guilty, and we always stay on our phone, saying, talk to me, and say, what, wait, let me finish this WhatsApp. In fact, I'm WhatsApping you. So, it's that kind of connection with people that we're trying to retain.
Yeah, this intangible heritage is so important.
Yeah.
One of the most boring Asian cities for me, actually the most boring, is Singapore.
Where I grew up.
Where you grew up.
You don't say that in Singapore, you get locked up. You don't get locked up, you get kicked out. Not welcome anymore.
But if we talk about the intangible heritage in Hong Kong, can you share more about how do you think it is developing well, or we still have a way to go to that kind of intangible?
Well, surprisingly, Hong Kong is doing very well, and to a large extent, it's driven by the people. I mean, conservation should always be about the people and from the people, and not from some experts, right? A small group of experts. So, and the Hong Kong people, the younger people, we talk about localism. And don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about Hong Kong's independence and all this. Let's not go there. So local identity, especially cultural identity, and that's what's been driving this understanding of Hong Kong's intangible cultural heritage. And in fact, you are one of them who's driving it. All your photograph is trying to capture that essence about intangible cultural heritage of Hong Kong, about local identity especially.
But I disagree with you that it's somehow working out, because look at Shui. Every time I go there, another building is torn down. And it's such a beautiful, typical area for Hong Kong. Beautiful dai pai dongs, there are different trades, small trades. You can buy interesting cloth, buttons.
I know, yeah.
And it's going to be gone. All that's going to be gone. So it's an example that it's not working.
I don't have a solution with it. So, but sometimes people talk to me as if I work for the government. So sometimes I know a lot of people see me as a running dog of the government. Right? So yeah, to some extent I am, but I don't have the solution. So what do you think? Or what do you think here?
No, I don't think there is a solution. It's just I'm observing it and I'm seeing how it's going, and I'm seeing it makes me sad every time I go. Another piece of Hong Kong heritage is gone, because in 10, 15 years the whole city is going to look different.
The way I see it is that it's a personal thought that it's going to get worse before it gets better. In one day, and we're going to be so overdeveloped and to such a ridiculous extent that everything will just collapse, and then to start again, then things will get better.
That's
It's just cynical.
That's a good idea.
I know you like that idea. Break it all down, repeat it again.
Yeah, that's the problem, though. You can't reverse it.
No, you can't. So, but the good thing is that, for example, your book on Hong Kong corner houses, and none of the building, not a single one of them featured in your book is considered a heritage building. But yet, these are the buildings, and you have correctly identified that these are the buildings that represents Hong Kong's future heritage store. So forget about Hong Kong's pre-Second World War buildings. There's so few of them, and located in isolated places. Conserving them is not going to do anything. Okay? And you want to make an impact, you have to conserve buildings en masse. So in the entire area, a small district at least, so you can see them in context. So, and those buildings feature in Michael Wolf's corner houses book. It's about Hong Kong's 50s, 60s architecture. And if you start to think about not freezing, controlling the development of districts in our urban area with this building, and in 20, 30 years time, we have a very nice heritage district.
But is that going to happen?
No. Well, but if you make enough noise, then it might happen.
Mm.
So, again, as I say, conservation all comes down to people. You go to, you look at the history of conservation anywhere in the world, in the city. It's never driven by the elite, never driven by the rich people or the government. It's always driven by the people. It's because people demand for it, and so the government responds.
Can I ask a question? Sure. Both of you. Just to throw in, a spanner in the works. I grew up, in one of those buildings that Michael described, and I lived there for a good part of my childhood in a very poor neighborhood, no window in a room. So when Michael, you talk about conserving old buildings like that, I think it's usually from an outsider's point of view. For those people who live there, the question of, do you want to conserve, and you don't have to live there, so it's easy for you to say, hold on to those old buildings. But for those people who have been living there, for most of their life, maybe they want a bit of better hygiene, a flush toilet, a room with a window, things like that. So maybe you care to discuss a little bit more about, an outsider looking inside, and romanticize, the picture. But for people who actually live there, they may want some progress and change. So the question is, how can we balance that? So don't go overboard with the romanticism of conservation.
No, I agree with you, and I had this. I've talked about this several times, especially after the fire in Fa Yuen Street a few years ago, where I don't know, 3 or 4 people died, and I realized that these buildings are fire traps. They have cardboard walls. They have small rooms. So you're right. It's a form of romanticizing. But I think architecturally, maybe it's possible to do something. I mean, Singapore, for instance, has always kept the facades, and behind the facades, you have a shopping mall or whatever. But it depends. I think one has to look at it architecturally as well and see what one can do from the inside.
This is what is being promoted in our program, in the conservation program, and is that we are not, modern conservation is not about conserving for conservation's sake. And that idea of, the romantic idea of protecting something as a piece of antique for exhibition, just to look at, that is an obsolete idea. That originated from the field of archaeology, finding things in the ground, the museum, and museum, basically museumology. So, but in today's context, especially in the Hong Kong context, the kind of conservation that at least we are promoting at the University of Hong Kong is about the reuse of building. How do you repurpose a building, and so that you make it relevant and useful again in today's world. And and in many ways, we are taking a rather unsentimental approach in conservation. So by focusing on the use. So, and you exactly right, Benny. I mean, for me at least, I'm totally against, on people wanting to conserve building exactly the way it is, so that they can come and take a look. Okay, that's not right. It's unethical. So, and so conservation is really about how to improve life, but retaining certain identity, retaining history. Okay? And a good example to illustrate this is the Blue House, which is going to be open soon. The Blue House cluster in Wan Chai. And this is once I told a bunch of people from UNESCO saying that this Blue House revitalization project is probably the world's first conservation project driven and led by a group of social workers. It is, and they've done the right thing. What they are doing is not about the building, they're focusing on the people, and they are trying to use conservation as a means, to improve the livelihood of the people and to protect the identity of the community. And I thought, wow, that's exactly right. So,
Dr. Lee, sorry.
Hold in, just hold in, please. Yeah, please.
So, because you just going to the topic of Blue House, of course it just started, but as we go down the road, how do you evaluate whether the whole rehabilitation or conservative approach is meaningful or is successful?
Well, the Blue House cluster, consisting of the Blue House, the Yellow House, and the Orange House, is being completed. And the opening is in mid-September, I believe. They have a grand opening. To take a look and see what they're really doing. So, and your question is this is the Blue House Cluster project is the first project of its kind with the slogan "Lao Uk Lao Yan." And so, I advise them, I help them, the social workers at the Blue House, on the parts of the project. And they asked me to translate Lao Uk Lao Yan. So I translated it as conservation first, community always. So because this is exactly what they're trying to aim at, to protect the community, to sustain the community. And and what they have done is really to upgrade the entire building. The building just as to serve a greater purpose, and not to look at every single detail as if it's an archaeological site and make them protect everything. Don't touch it, don't change it. So they see what has to be changed in order to make it more livable, and that is the idea. And the building is 100% compliance to all the building safety code. Okay? This is the most difficult part. How do you make it safe for the residents by meeting the code? Okay? How do you measure safety, right? So it's based on building codes like fire escape, and structural strength and all that, and this project, the difficulty is to make it compliant and without, altering the building into such an extent that you lose its character, its historical character. So we'll see, it's applied for a UNESCO Conservation Award, and the result should be out maybe early next month, so September. So if it wins an award, so that would be a good indication that they have done the right thing.
I have another question for you. I think you've done great work for Hong Kong, because the concept of conservation came rather late to Hong Kong. Now, throw our minds back to 1976, the General Post Office. Now, I'm talking about something, away from Sam Sui Po, right in Central. There was the General Post Office building at Wordian. It's something that, when we look at the photo now, we feel, there's something that hurt, because that building practically disappeared overnight to make way for progress. Because MTR MTR actually demolished the General Post Office in order to make way for I don't know what. But in those days, we have no say. So that building just disappeared overnight. Now, if we have the chance, now we know, it's important to conserve buildings like that. What would you, have done now?
For this, and as we advocate in our program again, you have to take a bigger approach to conservation if you want to make an impact. So you mentioned Singapore and Shanghai, and conservation is carried out under the framework of urban planning. So in other words, conservation, in order to make it effective, you have to be a part of the whole planning system. But right now it's not. In Hong Kong, that is still detached from planning. So in Hong Kong, the planning of the city in terms of how the land is being used, right, for what purpose, so that's all done. And if, the planning crash into a heritage building within the master plan, and then decision will be made, afterwards, to see whether that building can be saved or not. Usually, after you've done all the planning work, you can't be saved. Case in point is the Star Ferry Pier, the Queen's Pier. So because of all the infrastructure planning, the reclamation, the roads, everything's been planned. You can't move, it can't be moved. So the Star Ferry Pier, the Queen's Pier, were demolished. But again, that shows the demolition of the two piers. That shows how important it is for the community to make its voice heard. And then because of the protest, because of the noise made by the voice made by the community in the protest against the demolition of the Star Ferry Pier, and Hong Kong finally got its first ever conservation policy. And when that policy, the 2007 conservation policy, is a direct result of the protest against the demolition of the two piers. So make your voice heard if you want to make a difference in Hong Kong's protecting Hong Kong's heritage. So back to the way to do conservation, and we look at what has been done successfully throughout the world in cities. Has done carry out conservation successfully, and we can see and we find that conservation is part of the entire planning system. So that means if you do infrastructural planning, new town and whatnot, and in those cities, heritage, or rather heritage buildings are always taken into consideration as part of the planning. So if you have an area that need to be replanned into housing and whatnot, and there so happens there's a heritage village right there, and a traditional village right there in this site for your master plan, and then you have to figure out how to integrate this village if you want to conserve it with the rest of the master plan design, and not try to do it retrospectively, decide whether it can be retained or not, with the design that's already been done and without consideration to that village. Okay. So this Singapore has done it and showed that it's very successful, and Shanghai too. And I'm not familiar with Germany. What about in Germany?
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Conservation is a very important part of
planning.
Yeah.
So about France.
Also.
Yeah, France, they conserve everything. And it works, you see, so...
Look at Paris.
Yeah, look at Paris, don't let developer fool you. And they always have this scare tactic telling you that we need to develop and conservation is standing in the way of progress, and ruin Hong Kong's economy. It's not. Look at France, they control development to a huge extent, and it's a world city in Hong Kong, and we build and redevelop and redevelop, and we're not a world city. So they say something.
Can I say something? because France surrendered very quickly. So, Paris was spared. We're talking about Germany. Most of Germany was bombed out. So what we see now in Germany, they actually rebuilt. What you think, are old buildings, they actually rebuilt. So it's quite a different situation,
But let me get back to this romanticizing. There are many buildings or even neighborhoods which are really not fit to live in, which can be torn down. But what I don't understand is why, for instance, in Shetkip May, there's a beautiful, long, double row of houses, the typical houses with the rooftops and the little shops underneath, and one half is already gone. Why can't the government hire good architects and rebuild it? It doesn't have to look the same, but just in that style, and keep the neighborhood somehow intact. And behind it, there's a beautiful lane with trees. But no, because the property developers have so much power, and they tell them, and what ends up being there is an ugly 50-story high-rise.
Yeah.
And that's what I don't get.
And a lot of people will start to argue that, look, if you don't redevelop the place you're talking about, we tend to lose so much money, blah blah blah.
Yeah, of course, but
yeah. But the thing is that so the class, and earlier this year we went to Singapore with our conservation class, the master degree class, and we spoke with some of the most senior people in the Singapore's Urban Redevelopment Authority, which is a government authority, okay, and there's also a planning authority, a conservation authority, a land authority, and also an urban renewal authority. And we asked them about, or rather our Hong Kong class people asked the official about conservation in Singapore. And they say, like Singapore seems to be very successful because you have managed to conserve so many buildings, and in a typical Hong Kong way. But then, at what price? So you conserve so many buildings, and then you stand to lose, so much money, if you have to, if you were not conserving it and then rebuild it. And then this Singapore government guy started to laugh, and I said, no, that's not true. Say, make a guess of the percentage of the heritage building being conserved, or rather the land on which this conserved building stand, the percentage in proportion to all the developed, all the land that is in Singapore that can be developed for whatever use. And so, of course, it's a trick question, right? So we say, okay, give out, what's the answer? The answer is 0.03%. And we asked the official, I said, did we hear it wrong? You mean 3%? He said, no, it's 0.03%, not even 0.5%. Okay? And so it has no impact on the Singapore's economic development. In fact, it has other benefits like tourism and whatnot, And so in Hong Kong, so how many heritage buildings do we have? According to the list, government list, we have 1,444 and plus some of the later addition. So let's say 1,005 graded historic building, and if each and every one of these 1,500 building is conserved, and don't let people tell you that you stand to lose a lot of money. Those, because the amount of land they stand on compared with Hong Kong's the land area in Hong Kong that can be developed is minuscule. I would dare to stick my neck out and say that it's not even 0.5%. See, so it's all scare tactic. If we keep on harping on the fact that we're going to lose money, then forget it. Okay, why have conservation? Let's all make money. Why have West Kowloon Cultural District? Forget it. Let's make money. Okay, forget about art. Forget about heritage. So forget about Michael Wu. Who cares about you? You don't make money.
But it's not that they're going to lose money. It's that they can make more money.
Exactly, but it's presented as if they have lost money. It's money that shouldn't be made in the first place.
Yeah.
So in conservation, the best argument is to understand economics and argue with developer and whoever in economic term. They will lose. They will lose because in Hong Kong, once I make an argument, I say, look, in Hong Kong, there's never been any evidence, never, not in the past, not in the present, and not in the future, that conservation is undermining development, especially economic development. Never. Okay, it's not going to happen. So, and once people argue about why conserve, let's have public housing, and again I say that show me any evidence that conservation is in the way of public housing, that we are, because of conservation, is denying people of much needed housing. Never. There's no such evidence. It's never going to happen, because the places that is going to be conserved are not places that should be used for public housing. In fact, the places that the heritage building that we have lost, we have always lost it for commercial development. So, and the big question is, again, conservation. You should always ask the question, like, who stand to benefit? I mean, I'm all for development, but the question is, okay, let's say we give up this heritage building for something else, for development, make tons of money, good, all for money, I like money. Okay. And but the question is, are you getting something better in return? And who benefit from this new development? And these are questions that cannot be satisfactorily answered and cannot be, and usually the answer is not accept. Is you find it very difficult to accept by society. Who's benefit? And are we getting something better?
Developers.
Of course,
Yeah.
There's a case in point. Remember Oil Street?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oil Street, the buildings are nothing to write home about. And it was the government's warehouse. But before it was sold to Zhangguang for development. They rent out the space, and then artists, many arts groups responded to it because it was so cheap. And then in a very short time, the whole Oil Street compound was occupied. And then arts was there to revitalize the space. I mean, revitalize in a, you can't imagine how vibrant that was in a very short period of time. But instead of letting that develop into an art space, an art quarter, the government sold it to Zhangguang. And now, if you go down to Oil Street, then you can see, it's just a block of land, to be sold to people who could, afford to afford it. But what happened to all those arts group who were there? But instead of letting it grow organically, they then spend a lot of money trying to build West Kowloon. And now, we don't know, whether West Kowloon will have the same impact and effect as Oil Street. And I can say that, you can't have that kind of impact because Oil Street was an initiative, by the artists themselves. And whereas, if you, try and impose on the usage of land, such as West Kowloon, the effect will not be as great as something which is grown organically.
Yeah. Well, the same thing, what you're describing is it's very similar to how the development of the Fringe Club back in the 80s when you started it, and it was the initiative of enthusiasts and art people, and look what we have today, and so the Fringe Club is becoming something that's practically indispensable. I mean, nobody would ever imagine tearing this building down, which has become the headquarters of the Hong Kong Fringe Club. But at one point, as you told me before, there was a potential crisis of some developer would come in and buy up this very valuable corner site in the middle of Central for some commercial development. Is that right?
Yes. When we first moved in with no concept of conservation, we just wanted a space for arts, as simple as that. And because this is a landmark building, people know where it is, and then because of the high ceiling, which is good, for art use. But what saved us was actually not because of any other reason, but because this was built on a rather awkward piece of land. So government actually try and redevelop it. They were talking about tearing the building down to make way for a wider road. That's one option. The other option is to turn it into some kind of recreation area. And then, of course, the developers, they look at the piece of land and thought, well, what can we do with it? Because it's narrow and it's rather hard to use. That's why it was saved, but not forever, because we're only leasing it, on a five-year lease. Every moment we are threatened by a developer wanting to turn it into, they say, better use of the building.
Yeah. So back to Michael. So your photographs seems to make a quite impact in Hong Kong, in terms of what? What's your biggest contribution in Hong Kong? So why do we need you? Why do we love? Why do we care about you?
I think one of my favorite topics is vernacular culture, and it's a part of intangible heritage. But as I said, I think 10, 15 years ago, no one would have been aware of mops and gloves and bastard chairs.
Yeah, back alley.
Back alleys, yeah. So I created an awareness for that. And I think it has something to do with identity. Every city has its own identity. And people are suddenly realizing that this is part of their identity, which is really important, that you are proud of it and enjoy, respect it.
That is true, because I thought of something when I was watching the movie Ghost in the Shell, still playing, right? And the whole setting of this story, this set in the future is all in Hong Kong. And I look at it, I see somehow I keep seeing Michael Wolff images everywhere, damn, this Michael Wolff guy, it's like, you're really screwing our mind, You're brainwashing us.
I thought exactly the same thing. I thought a researcher must have bought the book and just referenced it,
Yeah, that could be true.
It's the same with the Transformer movie.
Yeah.
In that Quarry Bay building, they used a part of that as well.
That's right, especially your architectural density. There's a very, very approachable. So there you go. So, aren't you regret we have Michael Wolff? You saved Hong Kong.
Oh, Wayne, I love you.
So to do conservation, don't look at architects, conservationists, and look at economists, and look at people like Michael Wolff, and artists. They are the one who's going to help conserve Hong Kong. Right? Artists, like Benny, Michael Wolff. Right?
Can you talk a little bit more about the buildings that have been rebuilt, and then they look like they are original, but in fact they are not. But when we go there as tourists, and when we still see those, do you think that's ethical?
Oh, well, at one point, talking about 30, 40, 50 years ago, that seems to be a good idea, and I felt how it came about is after the Second World War, places like Warsaw, in some of the German cities, like Cologne, the famous Cologne Cathedral, one of the best examples of Baroque architecture in Cologne Cathedral. Dresden.
Classic.
No, it's Cologne Cathedral. Was bombed out. Dresden too. And then it was painstakingly rebuilt because of the importance, the cultural significance, the historical significance to the city. So like Warsaw was painstakingly rebuilt, and they became a World Heritage Site. And because of this is such a good example of collective memory. You know the Warsaw City case, right? A bunch of architecture professors before the Germans invaded, they saved all the cities, all the drawing, the plans, all the buildings, and they hide it in the cellar or something. And of course, the Germans destroyed the city. I mean, the Nazi, destroyed the city. And after the war, all these the professor retrieved the plan and then they reconstructed every single building. So it shows the spirit of the people, So and for them, that became very important as a symbol. And and because of example like this, extreme example like this, that inspired people to think, that the reconstructing building that's gone, or they have to demolish it and rebuild it somewhere, kind of look the same, would be all right. But it's not all right because these reconstruction projects, they don't carry the same kind of significance as places like Warsaw and Cologne and Dresden. And so what example do we have in Hong Kong? Murray House. Yeah, Murray House.
If you comment on that.
Yeah, Murray House.
Wedding Car Street.
You should all go, Wedding Car Street. These are almost like comedy. I would see them as architectural comedies. And you go to Murray House in Stanley. So what you see is not a conservation project. I mean, the story's always been like the Murray House is moved from Central to Stanley. No, not true. Totally not true. And what happened was that the facing stones, the granite slabs and the stone columns of Murray House has been saved and kept somewhere. Actually, well, that's another story. I'm not going to go into that. I know about that storage place because I was there. And and then when the time came, finally the government had to do something. The stone has been left for 20, 30 years. Right? So, and they found this public housing estate. They needed a shopping mall, so they built a shopping mall, a brand new shopping mall of reinforced concrete, but roughly to the size of the original Murray House, so that they can replant all the stone back to this new building. So that is not a conservation project, but it's an outstanding recycling project. Yeah, somebody will give them an award. Yeah, recycling, very friendly to the environment. And another story that's fake is that the stone from the original building has been carefully numbered so that when it's placed back, onto for reconstruction, they know exactly the location. No, not true. The numbering, they did some numbering, but in the end, I think they gave up, because it's too complicated. So according to the architect who handled this project, the Murray House, they say that they just kind of guess, what this stone would go where, So it's all over the place, and in the end, they left with pieces of stone. They didn't know where to fit in, So, and for places that they couldn't find the right piece, and they have to make new ones, So again, it's fake, So don't believe it. Okay? And the Stanley House, I got more to brag about. And you'll find that besides the old stones and the old columns on this new shopping mall, there are also freestanding columns taken from shop houses that have been demolished, I believe from Mongkok, right? And then you also have a pier, and that has been also demolished, and then reconstructed, the Blake's Pier. So I'm sure more is to come, So it becomes like a collection place for all these abandoned, heritage, Yeah, lost heritage, This is a project. Michael has this one of my favorite projects, another favorite, the Hong Kong Lost Laundry. So he goes around the city capturing images of a laundry that's been blown away and gets stuck somewhere forever, So your bra, panties, underwear, get stuck, So, fantastic.
What do you think of Wedding Car Street?
Okay, another comedy is your favorite, right? Lidong Street. So Lidong Street is gone. So now what you see is, people ask me whether those are heritage buildings. I say, of course not. Those, I don't know where the developer had the idea from. These are buildings that's never happened in Hong Kong. It's vaguely resemble buildings somewhere in London, maybe, or I don't know, in Germany or on drugs. So those are cartoon buildings.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Ho Yin, and thank you, Michael, for today.